I felt like I could reach out and cradle the Earth in my hands. Astronauts who experience the overview effect often break down in tears as their brains struggle to process seeing our entire planet as a single, fragile entity suspended in darkness. The psychological phenomenon transforms 71% of space travelers, permanently altering how they perceive reality long after returning home. As astronaut Edgar Mitchell confided after Apollo 14, "Something happens to you out there." Today, we're exploring how space doesn't just expand our understanding of the universe, it fundamentally breaks and rebuilds the human mind, rewiring neural pathways and shifting worldviews in ways science is only beginning to understand. Take a moment and look at your surroundings. Your brain is constantly processing spatial information: the size of your room, the distance to the door, how far you'd need to walk to get a snack. This innate ability to gauge scale and distance is wired into our neural architecture through millions of years of evolution. Our ancestors needed to judge if a predator was close enough to pose a danger, or if that berry bush was worth the journey. We developed precise neural mechanisms to handle distances relevant to our survival. A few feet, several miles, maybe the occasional mountain range. Our brains excel at processing what neuroscientists call human-scale environments. But what happens when that same brain, evolved for judging if a cave is large enough for shelter, tries to comprehend cosmic distances? This is where our mental architecture begins to falter. Research from cognitive neuroscience shows our brains lack dedicated neural pathways for processing astronomical scale. When confronted with cosmic vastness, our spatial cognition systems essentially short-circuit. Consider this: light travels at 186,000 miles per second. A light year equals roughly 5.9 trillion miles. The Milky Way galaxy spans 100,000 light-years, approximately 590 quintillion miles. Like a thimble trying to contain an ocean, our minds cannot truly comprehend these values. The numbers become cognitively empty, we can say the words, but they hold no genuine meaning in our perception. And the Milky Way is minuscule compared to some cosmic structures. The recently discovered Alcyoneus radio galaxy stretches 16.3 million light-years across space, 163 times larger than our entire galaxy. This fundamental mismatch between evolved perception and cosmic reality creates what neuroscientist Dr. David Eagleman calls scale vertigo, a perceptual state where the brain generates cognitive dissonance when faced with incomprehensible vastness. Astronauts report feeling infinitesimally small, yet paradoxically expanded, as if their consciousness stretches to accommodate the void. This scale dissonance creates measurable physiological responses. Brain imaging shows that when people contemplate cosmic scale, activation patterns mirror those seen during existential crises. The prefrontal cortex becomes hyperactive while the parietal lobe shows decreased activity, struggling to perform its normal spatial function. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania found that contemplating astronomical scales triggers the same stress responses as confronting mortality: increased cortisol, elevated heart rate, and activation of the amygdala. Our brains interpret cosmic scale as a threat because it challenges our fundamental understanding of reality. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell described this sensation after his Apollo 14 mission. You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. His experience aligns perfectly with the neurophysiological evidence. A brain encountering scale it cannot process undergoes a fundamental perceptual shift. But this perceptual breakdown creates an opportunity for cognitive expansion. When conventional spatial processing systems fail, the brain adapts by creating new neural pathways. This neuroplasticity allows astronauts to develop cosmic perception, a fundamentally different way of understanding scale impossible to achieve on Earth. This restructuring leads to the overview effect, a profound alteration in consciousness where national boundaries disappear, terrestrial conflicts seem trivial, and Earth is perceived as a single fragile ecosystem. The overview effect represents a cognitive transformation, with astronauts' brain scans showing enhanced connectivity between regions responsible for self-perception and spatial processing. Their brains literally rewire to accommodate a new understanding of scale. While our brains adapt to comprehend the vastness of space, there's another fundamental dimension that warps beyond Earth's atmosphere: our perception of time itself. This distortion begins almost immediately after reaching orbit, creating a psychological experience unlike anything possible on our home planet. On Earth, our temporal awareness is anchored by natural rhythms that have shaped human evolution for millennia. The alternation of daylight and darkness regulates our hormones and energy levels, while seasonal changes guide our activities from agriculture to celebrations. These patterns are so ingrained that we rarely question how artificial our temporal divisions actually are. Space shatters these foundational rhythms. Aboard the International Space Station, astronauts witness 16 sunrises and sunsets daily as they orbit Earth every 90 minutes. Like watching Earth's natural rhythm in fast forward, this compressed day-night cycle bombards the brain with temporal signals it never evolved to process. Imagine experiencing an entire day condensed into just 90 minutes. This disruption manifests physically. Without consistent exposure to Earth's day-night cycle, astronauts experience significant circadian rhythm disturbances. Their bodies produce stress hormones at inappropriate times, sleep quality deteriorates, and fatigue becomes constant. These physical symptoms create a feedback loop that further distorts time perception. Hours stretch endlessly when exhausted yet unable to sleep. During spacewalks, this distortion intensifies dramatically. As one astronaut described after an EVA, floating in that endless black void, watching continents slide beneath me while my mind struggled to measure passing minutes, I checked my timer and was shocked to find only 20 minutes had passed when it felt like I'd been out there for hours. The brain, deprived of new stimuli and temporal markers, stretches its perception of passing time in the void's sensory monotony. Yet paradoxically, when astronauts reflect on their missions after returning home, they often describe the opposite effect: time compression. 6-month stays aboard the ISS somehow condense in memory to feel like mere weeks. This contradictory experience, where individual moments stretch endlessly while extended periods somehow shrink, highlights how malleable our temporal perception truly is when removed from Earth's familiar cues. The neurological basis for these distortions lies in how our brains process time without external markers. On Earth, our internal clock relies on environmental cues to maintain synchronization. When these signals become chaotic, the brain's timekeeping systems, primarily regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, begin operating independently of external reality, creating a subjective experience of time disconnected from clock-measured duration. This reflects genuine changes in brain function. Without Earth's gravitational and temporal anchors, neural pathways responsible for time perception process information differently. The brain, remarkably adaptable, creates new frameworks for understanding duration when traditional markers disappear. There's a physical reality to this temporal fluidity as well. Astronauts orbiting at 17,500 miles per hour experience what Einstein's relativity predicts. They age fractionally slower than people on Earth due to their velocity. Though only milliseconds over a 6-month mission, it's measurable. An astronaut's watch literally ticks at a different rate than identical timepieces on Earth, demonstrating how even time's flow depends on one's reference frame. Perhaps most profound are the lasting changes in temporal perspective that astronauts bring back to Earth. After experiencing time's elasticity in space, many develop a more fluid relationship with time. Daily urgencies and deadlines that once seemed all-important diminish against the backdrop of having witnessed multiple sunrises within a single Earth hour. Beyond the warping of time lies perhaps the most profoundly disorienting aspect of space travel: the complete absence of down. While gravity seems like just another force of nature, it's actually the fundamental constant that has shaped human evolution for millions of years. When astronauts first enter zero gravity, their brains, which have relied on gravitational orientation since before birth, suddenly receive error messages from every sensory system, triggering a neural crisis that forces a complete rewiring of spatial processing. Imagine the ground beneath your feet, a certainty you've trusted since your first steps, suddenly vanishing. Every reference point disappears, leaving your brain frantically searching for stability in a world with no anchors. This mirrors the disorientation astronauts experience in zero gravity. From infancy through adulthood, gravity silently architects our neural structures. As babies, we strengthen neck muscles against gravity's pull. As toddlers, our balance systems calibrate precisely to Earth's gravitational field. By adulthood, this constant force becomes so embedded in our perception that we've constructed elaborate neural pathways around it, pathways that become instantly obsolete in space. The vestibular system within our inner ears serves as gravity's primary interpreter on Earth, detecting minimal changes in head position relative to gravity's pull. In space, this ancient mechanism receives inputs it was never designed to process. Fluid that normally settles at the bottom of the inner ear floats freely, sending confusing signals that contradict visual information. This sensory contradiction creates space adaptation syndrome, affecting approximately 70% of astronauts during their first days in orbit. The brain, receiving conflicting orientation signals, responds with the same defense mechanism used for potential poisoning, nausea, and vomiting. Astronauts describe this as profoundly worse than any earthbound motion sickness, a disorientation that persists because there's no stable reference point. The vestibular system is sending error signals to the brain, explains neuroscientists studying this phenomenon. The system actively provides incorrect information. This creates cognitive confusion unlike anything experienced on Earth, where gravity remains a constant reference despite other disorienting circumstances. This physiological disruption triggers remarkable neuroplasticity. The brain begins fundamental rewiring, creating new frameworks for understanding space without gravity's influence. Neuroimaging reveals physical transformations in astronauts' brains, shifts in gray matter volume and reorganization of neural pathways for spatial processing. The brain essentially develops new systems for understanding three-dimensional space without gravity's orienting presence. This adaptation produces strange perceptual phenomena. Astronauts report persistent sensations of being upside down regardless of their actual orientation. Others describe an inability to determine object orientation without conscious effort. A floating book might appear to spontaneously flip as the brain struggles to assign stable spatial coordinates. Some experience phantom sensations, similar to those reported by amputees, as if the brain searches for gravitational feedback that no longer exists. These physical changes cascade into profound psychological effects. The brain, untethered from its gravitational reference frame, enters states resembling dreamlike awareness. Astronauts report heightened pattern recognition, detecting correlations between events that might go unnoticed on Earth. Emotional processing shifts as well, with many describing both detachment from everyday concerns and intensified responses to beauty and connection. One astronaut compared the sensation to having your brain completely reboot and reinstall its operating system. Another noted that after about 2 weeks, something clicks. Suddenly your brain stops fighting and creates an entirely new way of understanding space. It's like being born again with different sensory capabilities. This neural reorganization represents one of the most extreme examples of brain plasticity ever observed. Under conditions impossible to replicate on Earth, the brain demonstrates remarkable adaptability, creating entirely new systems for spatial processing that expand our understanding of neural flexibility. Beyond neuroplasticity, a more profound transformation occurs in space, one that emerges when astronauts experience absolute cosmic isolation. Imagine floating so distant from Earth that you can obscure our entire planet with your thumb. This represents a psychological threshold where the mind confronts complete detachment from everything that defines human experience. Humans evolved as intensely social creatures, our brains wired for feedback from others and our surroundings. This environmental dialogue forms the foundation of our self-concept. Neuroscience shows that our sense of identity depends on social interaction and environmental cues, the voices we hear, faces we recognize, and physical spaces we inhabit. These elements anchor our consciousness in reality. Space travel strips away these anchors entirely. As astronauts venture further from Earth, they experience isolation unlike anything possible on our planet. Even in Earth's most remote locations, Antarctic research stations or isolated mountaintops, a fundamental connection to the planetary ecosystem remains. The air you breathe links you to forests thousands of miles away. Gravity grounds you to the same force experienced by every other human. In space, this connection dissolves. Earth becomes a pale blue dot, distant as a fading heartbeat, visible but unreachable. This perspective triggers what researchers now recognize as a unique neurological state characterized by a dissolution of ego boundaries, where the distinction between self and universe becomes permeable. This ego dissolution activates the brain's default mode network, neurological architecture associated with introspection and self-referential thought. When astronauts experience both extreme isolation and the profound awe of witnessing Earth as a distant object, their DMN engages in unusual patterns. The brain essentially reconfigures its understanding of self, creating a new identity that exists without the social and environmental context that previously defined it. Astronauts describe this state as a cosmic consciousness where they feel simultaneously insignificant yet profoundly connected to everything. This represents genuine neurological reorganization. The combination of sensory deprivation with overwhelming visual perspective creates conditions that fundamentally alter how consciousness processes reality. Despite extensive psychological training, no simulation fully prepares the mind for this experience. Space agencies implement robust psychological support systems precisely because they recognize the profound nature of this isolation. Astronauts develop specific coping mechanisms, finding meaning in minimal sensory environments and transforming mundane tasks into meaningful rituals. The psychological risks are substantial. Some astronauts report depersonalization, feeling detached from their own identity. Existential anxiety can emerge as the brain struggles to integrate this radical perspective shift. The cognitive detachment that begins as wonder can sometimes evolve into problematic disconnection from normal human concerns. Yet this psychological state offers remarkable transformative potential. Many astronauts return with dramatically altered worldviews. They often display increased empathy, reduced attachment to material possessions, and heightened commitment to environmental protection. The experience of seeing Earth as a single, borderless system fundamentally changes how they conceptualize human conflicts and divisions. The psychological tools astronauts develop inform approaches to managing isolation, anxiety, and existential distress on Earth. What makes this isolation uniquely transformative is its combination of physical detachment with visual perspective. Unlike earthbound practices that induce temporary states of ego dissolution, the astronauts' experience incorporates actual physical reality. The transformation extends beyond temporary alteration of consciousness. Neurological studies indicate lasting changes in how astronauts process information related to self and others. Their brains develop enhanced neural pathways for integrating seemingly contradictory perspectives, feeling both minuscule within the cosmic scale, yet deeply significant as conscious observers. This cognitive flexibility persists long after they return to Earth. This cognitive flexibility is put to the ultimate test when astronauts encounter quantum phenomena that fundamentally challenge our most basic understanding of existence. While earthbound humans evolved to perceive reality as solid, predictable, and governed by straightforward cause and effect, those working in space confront a universe that refuses to behave according to such intuitive frameworks. Our brains develop to navigate a world where objects remain in one place, where time flows in one direction, and where things either exist or don't. These perceptual shortcuts served our ancestors well as they hunted prey, avoided predators, and built shelters. They were evolutionary advantages, until they weren't. After adapting to the disorientation of zero gravity and altered time perception, astronauts face an even greater cognitive challenge: quantum mechanics. This creates a profound mental friction when they confront particles that behave contrary to familiar logic. Like watching a coin spin in midair, never settling on heads or tails until someone looks at it, the very act of observation changes experimental outcomes, creating a conceptual paradox our minds aren't wired to process. Working with quantum experiments, you begin to question everything you thought you knew about reality, reports ISS physicist Dr. Amara Chen. The particles behave as if our conventional understanding of existence is merely convenient fiction. In the microgravity environment of space, quantum effects become more pronounced. Without Earth's gravitational interference, particles clearly demonstrate their wave-particle duality, existing as probability clouds that collapse into definite states only when measured. For astronauts conducting these experiments, this directly challenges their perception of reality. The practical engagement with these phenomena makes them particularly destabilizing. Quantum mechanics in space demands daily interaction with a reality that defies common sense. The mental adaptations required to operate effectively create unique cognitive patterns. Recent experiments suggest that spacetime itself may exhibit quantum superposition, like a musical chord where multiple notes resonate simultaneously until one is isolated. The fundamental structure of the universe could occupy different configurations at once. This validates theories of quantum gravity proposing that spacetime consists of tiny vibrational strings or loops forming the fabric of reality. Commander Wei Liu describes it. You realize the universe isn't just what you see, it's a vast landscape of possibilities that solidify only when observed. This confrontation with quantum uncertainty creates measurable shifts in cognitive patterns. Astronauts develop increased tolerance for ambiguity, rewiring their thought processes to accommodate multiple simultaneous truths. They navigate what physicists call complementarity, holding contradictory models as valid depending on context and measurement. The scale becomes more profound when considered alongside cosmic vastness. With approximately 3.2 times 10 to the power of 23 planets across the observable universe, quantum mechanics expands possibilities exponentially. The universe becomes a tapestry of probabilities playing out across countless worlds. Returning astronauts demonstrate enhanced ability to integrate contradictory information, increased comfort with ambiguity, and greater flexibility in conceptual thinking. These changes persist long after their return, suggesting fundamental alterations in neural architecture. This comfort with uncertainty becomes a philosophical stance. Many describe finding liberation in accepting reality as fundamentally probabilistic. The shift extends beyond physics. Former astronauts report decreased anxiety about the future and enhanced adaptability to unexpected changes. Physicists are developing experimental proposals to test quantum gravity theories, which could provide definitive evidence of gravity's quantum nature. As our understanding deepens, astronauts serve as both researchers and subjects, their minds becoming laboratories for how human consciousness adapts when confronted with realities that defy evolutionary programming. You don't need to leave Earth to experience space travel's mind-expanding benefits. Astronauts like Chris Hadfield report that seeing our planet from above creates a powerful reminder of our shared humanity and the fragility of our planet. This perspective shift fundamentally changes how they approach daily challenges. Earth-based methods are emerging to access these transformative states. Virtual reality simulations of the overview effect and specialized meditation practices foster connection and reduce anxiety. These techniques allow us to temporarily step outside our limited perspective and view our problems from a cosmic viewpoint. By applying this expanded awareness, we can navigate earthbound struggles with greater calm. Consider seeking these perspective-shifting experiences to transform your approach to life's challenges.